Eyewitness News.
It takes a specialist to make sense out of Minnesota's weather. Meteorologist Dennis Falcon makes sense.
This is the only weather department in town with only meteorologists on its staff. And let me tell you why that's important. A meteorologist knows why something is happening and can better forecast what's going to happen.
Dennis Falcon.
I had not been in broadcast meteorology very long when I was fortunate to come to the Twin Cities. I had graduated Florida State in 1974 with a degree in meteorology, and as a last-minute decision decided to go into television and went to Atlanta, where I had to learn it. I had to learn it from the ground up. So every day after the noon newscast, I taped a program like it was the real thing. And after about 6 weeks of that, they turned me loose. But I stayed there in Atlanta for 3 years doing noontime weather, and then decided, okay, I need to get out onto my own. So went down to West Palm Beach in the summer of '77 and was the chief meteorologist. In fact, that market's first broadcast meteorologist. They had always used booth announcers before then. I was on the air maybe 3 or 4 months competing against an NBC affiliate, which was consulted by Frank Magid Enterprise, and apparently, should I say, doing damage to them fairly quick. And unbeknownst to me at the time, Frank Magid was sending my tapes out to get me out of the market, and one of those tapes landed at KSTP because Dr. Walt Lyons was leaving to go to Chicago, and they needed a meteorologist, and fairly quick. So apparently my tape was researched in the Minneapolis-St. Paul market and came out on top of the people they were looking, and all of a sudden I got a phone call from KSTP a couple weeks before Thanksgiving of '77 wondering if I would be interested in being in flying up to Minneapolis and being talked to about a job. And I thought, I just got to Florida. I grew up in Florida. Why would I want to do this? So I didn't do anything with it. And then about a week before Thanksgiving, they called again and say, look, we really need to come up. You need to come up here and talk to us about this job. So I thought, okay, well, my wife was going to be in Atlanta for Thanksgiving, and I had to work Thanksgiving Day because there wasn't any backup for me. I thought, okay, fine. I don't remember snow, so I'll fly up to Minneapolis on the Saturday, and then just look around and then come home. How bad could it be? So I fly up and on that Saturday, and there's a foot of snow on the ground, and I'm like a little kid in a candy store with my nose pressed up against the airplane window, like, wow. So met Stanley Hubbard at a country club. I couldn't tell you where. It was somewhere in Minneapolis, and nice gentleman. We had lunch, and he took me to the station, and I was just absolutely mesmerized by what I saw. And then we went into the KSTP weather room, and talk about a kid in a candy shop. There was its own radar, its own satellite receiving station, instruments I could only dream of. And so then we went upstairs into the conference room, and Stanley sits me down along with Stan Turner, who was the news director at the time. So he looks at me and says, now, we got to find out how much money it's going to take to get you up here, because we really want to come here. I thought, now, this is 1977. I'm making $13,000 and not really making ends meet down there. In 1977, that still wasn't a lot of money to live on and rent an apartment. So I thought, okay, I'm just going to put this out of reach. I looked at Stanley Hubbard and I said, I'm not coming up here for less than $20,000. And he looks at me with a puzzled look. He looks over at Stan Turner, looks back at me and says, my God, I've got to pay you more than that. And I thought, oh boy, I am so done here. So that's pretty much how I ended up getting hired, but it was one of the best personal and professional decisions I ever made. It was terrific. So I started here went on the air early January 1978 and stayed with them for 8.5 years. Well, I knew I had very big shoes to fill. When I was in the previous markets before coming here, both in Atlanta and in West Palm Beach, I would see the cover of Broadcasting, and the Hubbard family would buy 1/4 of those covers. And so I knew of its reputation, both from the professional point, that this was a flagship station. And as I said, the old man, S.E. Hubbard, was one of the pioneers. And he bought the first television camera at the World's Fair before there was even anything with television. He put a helipad on the Hubbard building on the city line of Minneapolis-St. Paul before there was even any thought of using helicopters in news business. So this was a forward-thinking company. So I knew I was going into something very special. And when I first walked into that weather office and saw what was going on, it was, oh my gosh, this is going to be quite something. And fortunately, the Hubbard family, Stanley, didn't throw me on the deep end of the pool right out of the, just throw me on the deep end of the pool and, okay, you're on the air, red lights on, start talking. We actually did rehearsals for a week. So I got to interact with Ron Majors and Tom Ryther at the time, and that helped quite a bit. And I would tape the weather program, and Stanley Hubbard was upstairs along with consultant Frank Magid, and they would look at the tape. Okay, now do that again and do this and do this and do this. Oh, okay, so this is what you want me to do. I did insist on making one change, though, when they first came here. And you may recall from when Walt Lyons was doing the program, his forecast was handwritten on this little cube that you turn. I'm left-handed. My handwriting was horrible. The nuns hated it. The priest hated it all the way through school. I thought, this isn't going to work. And I said, you all have a Chiron, right? And they said, yes. And I said, well, why not put the forecast on Chiron? Okay, we can do that. So we made those changes, and that was an instant hit. So that was the initial change that we made. But other than that, it was, Walt came from the same school of thought that I did. When you're up in front of the camera, you make it personable, but you tell the weather like it's a story. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And my philosophy was similar to Walt's. If you reach the forecast, your viewers should be able to figure that forecast without them having to see it on the screen. If you do that, you've done your job. But you just got to be yourself, because folks will see right through that. And there was none better than allowing you to be yourself than sitting next to Ron Majors. He was as personal as the day is long. And then when Cindy came along a year later, I mean, we just clicked. It was a solid team that I have not seen matched. I can remember fondly the Doppler radar. A little backstory on that. The old man had called John Dooley, meteorologist there, up to his office, and the old man was reading a National Enquirer, and the National Enquirer was talking about this new radar that could see tornadoes, and the old man, we got to get this, we got to get this. Well, sir, it hasn't been invented yet, but, well, when it happens, we'll get it. Well, a company called Enterprise Electronics in Enterprise, Alabama, produced one. It was a 5-centimeter Doppler radar, and by golly, we were going to be the first one to get it. And we did, with serial number 1, and got that. And I believe we put it on the air in April or May of '81. So now we're approaching the severe weather season. So my wife was expecting twin boys, so on the weekend of June 10th, 11th, 12th, I was in the hospital with them for delivery, and that was a 3-day severe weather event. And on June 12th, the twins were born, which was a Friday, and then on June 14th, there was a tornado that formed in Edina. And Gene Rubin was on duty for me on the weekend. And John Dooley's looking at the radar, but he thought he had the tornado, the signature, but he wasn't quite sure what he was looking at. We didn't have a test case. So Dooley went onto the roof of the building and looked toward the south, towards Edina, and saw the funnel cloud, and all of a sudden saw the funnel cloud turn black, which meant touchdown. So he ran downstairs and said, we've got it, we've got it, we've got it. And they went on the air with the tornado, and of course it turned into the Roseville tornado, and passed within a half mile of Midway Hospital where I was, and I was out in the hallway with my wife and newborns, the twins, and I kept sneaking back into the room to see what was going on, and the nurses were not happy with me doing that. But that was a true test case for that, and we never looked back. Fast forward to 1984, we now had a severe thunderstorm coming towards the heart of Minneapolis. And I went on the air with it, severe thunderstorm, you see, don't wait for anybody to give you a formal warning, you know, the whole 9 yards. But I didn't go on there and say tornado warning because we didn't have anything. Well, we lost the cell and the ground targets right around the core of Minneapolis. When the storm emerged out of the ground targets, it had a signature on it, the likes we hadn't seen, and the later damage reports, it was an F4 on the old Fujita scale. So we got called on the carpet the next day. We've got all this equipment. Why couldn't you tell us about it? Well, sir, we lost it in the ground targets. Well, how do we get around that? Well, we buy a clutter canceller. It's about $125,000, $140,000. And Ralph Dolan, the general manager, said, it's going to blow my whole budget, but buy it. So we bought it. So that was the Doppler radar.
There's the cool air all the way down to Kansas City. Currently it's 36, 34 in Omaha, but that isn't actually...
Dave, when I came there, wasn't used on the air at all. He was a background meteorologist hired by Walt Lyons when Walt had his own company as a sidelight when he was there. When I got there, I thought, why aren't we using Dave? So there was a morning show that KSTP did called Country Day, and meteorologist Rob Dixon was the weather talent then. And Rob would take a day off or something, and I thought, well, I'm not coming in at that hour. You know, I don't have any sleep. I said, let's put Dave on. And Dave did a good job. He cut his teeth on that. But fast forward now to the early 80s, Gene Rubin was doing the weekends, and Gene was going to take a weekend off, and I really didn't want to work weekends. I had newborns in the house, and I knew I would get in trouble if I did it, so I didn't tell then news director Bob Jordan that I was going to put Dave Dahl on the air. We're just kind of like, oh, there he is type thing. And so we put Dave on the air at 6 and 10 on that Saturday and that Sunday, and Dave did a terrific job. I thought, okay, of course I had the riot act read to me by the news director when I got in on Monday, but I said, did he do a bad job? No, he didn't. So what's the problem? So then we began starting a 5 o'clock news, and I said, have Dave do it. And Dave did the 5 o'clock news, and then he would be the backup then for 6 and 10. And Gene Rubin left for the Weather Channel, so Dave was able to do the weekends as well. So he would do like a Wednesday through Friday 5 o'clock, and then he was the talent for the 6 and 10 on the weekends, and he never looked back. He's done very well. I'm very proud of Dave. I visited the Twin Cities last year in 2008, and called up Dave, and I said, hey, I'd really like to stop by and see you. So Dave took me around the building and everything, and it had changed quite a bit, but it was so nice seeing some people. And there were a couple of people on the assignment desk just looking, oh my God, and they were there when I was there, so it was really nice.
Now, from Minnesota's leading news station, Cindy Bucato, Stan Turner, Dennis Felkin, and Bob Bruce, this is Eyewitness News.
We slipped in the ratings around 1980. WCCO who had a terrific product, made a real strong push. And KSTP lost its #1 ranking at 10 o'clock, and 10 o'clock was it for everybody. So the KSTP newsroom had a little bit of a shuffle. We hired Stanley hired a news director named Bob Jordan out of Orlando, who came in and shook the cobwebs off the KSTP newsroom and got us back to #1. And it didn't take long. And that helped a lot. But then I don't have an honest answer as to why, when we get into the mid-'80s, we started slipping again. And this time the reaction was, well, let's go after the talent. So all of a sudden, anchors were sitting on ejector seats, and that doesn't work. Didn't work then, it doesn't work today, because there's no stability. People don't know who to trust, and by the time they get to learn somebody, he or she is gone based on some weird questions on some research. And part of the problem that Hubbard had at the time was he was investing very heavily in satellite. He had his company. He had one of 3 licenses to broadcast off satellites, and that was tremendous. He didn't believe in cable. He saw the future as being satellite. Again, that forward-thinking pioneer thought that he had, and he was right. But it cost a lot of money, millions and millions of dollars. And up until that point, the newsroom never really had a budget. If I needed something, a piece of equipment, I walked upstairs and said, Stanley, this would be an advantage to us. Here's why. He said, buy it. Which, you know, that was a dream. But in order for his satellite company, Direct Broadcast Satellite, to work, he needed money. So all of a sudden, the newsroom had to have a budget. And we began contracting. So all of our specialists were let go, and contracts weren't being renewed. There was a purge in there in 1985, 1986. A new general manager was hired from a Scripps Howard station in Cincinnati, Bob Rigobuto, and he was hired with the mandate to downsize. And apparently the mandate was, we don't care how you do it, just do it. There were people coming into work and they found out they didn't have a job because their desk was gone. It's a human resources nightmare today. But that's what happened, and he took the KSTP weather department, which had 9 meteorologists and a part-time office manager to handle the workload of all the paperwork that we had, and downsized us to 4, and that was very, very difficult.
You know him as Dennis Feldgen, TV meteorologist for Eyewitness News. But by day, our friendly meteorologist becomes champion of the young and young at heart because he's Mr. Weather.
Hi, kids.
Hi, Mr. Weather.
If your school or social organization would like a visit from Mr. Weather just right, Mr. Weather, KSTP TV, 3415 University Avenue, St. Paul, Minnesota.
Together, we'll make learning fun, and that's team spirit. That came about because we were slipping in the ratings. In 1985, we were number 2, heading to number 3, and their research showed that, well, you know, we're throwing news anchors overboard. We can't do anything here. Let's build on the strength of weather. So they decided, they being the Frank Magid consultants, decided on this campaign called Mr. Weather. And the idea behind that was, and I was already going to schools anyway. I thoroughly enjoyed that, and they wanted to take that aspect and run with it and really beef it up. So I would have somebody from the production department set up everything I would need at a predetermined school, and I would come out, I would do my talk with slides, give them the slide presentation, do this little experiment with the empty metal can, and heat it up and put it into water, and the can, of course, would collapse, and that was an explanation of air pressure. And we built commercials around it and a whole campaign, and it was a lot of fun. But the idea was that, you know, I'm doing a lot of weather, I'm doing a lot of stuff, but I can't block out the whole afternoon to do this. That's why I needed the help. Well, unfortunately, the whole thing kind of unraveled because, again, we were being downsized, and I was told by KSTP's promotion department, who was run by one of Stanley's daughters, Ginny Hubbard, said, we're not going to do this anymore. You know, you're on your own to do this. And I said, I can't do this. I cannot do this. It's taking away from the time I need here. It's taking away from my family. By then, I had 3 little boys in the house under the age of 3, so we were pretty busy. So I said, no. He says, well, you're going to have to do this or else. And I just stormed out of the office. I was so angry. And so what I did was, to get around that, was we had a part-time office manager, Elaine Watson. And I said, you want to help me on this? And she said, sure. So that was how I got around it, but I made very clear, this stops now. Don't get any more schools. And I always thought that was an unfortunate unraveling of the whole thing. But while it lasted, it was kind of fun. And I saw the promotion spot, and I looked back and went, oh my gosh. I mean, I look at the promotion spot, and here's this meteorologist walking through the hallways of the school looking, and I think, aren't there laws against that now? Very different air. Like, what's that guy doing unescorted through a school? Like, there's Mr. Weather. So it was kind of strange. But it was a fun campaign. It was not handled very well at all. And while that was going on, my contract was coming up, and it was like, oh boy, this is not good. But even through all of that, I really wanted to stay. I really, truly wanted to stay. But I pulled Dave Dahl aside, who was doing weekends at the time, and kept him in the loop, and I said, you better be prepared to take over this ship, because I don't think I'm going to be here. I moved on to KARE TV for 3.5 years, and I look back at that, and that whole situation on both on my end and probably on Hubbard Broadcasting's end probably could have been handled much better. Stanley Hubbard, even from who we affectionately call the old man, S.E. Hubbard, didn't like attorneys, hated unions, hated attorneys. So when we got in, television had changed in the early 80s where they wanted to put their talent under contract. And I had that experience with them in the early 80s, and it wasn't a very good experience at all. In fact, it was a horrible experience. You can't negotiate your own contract. You got to sit down with their lawyers, but you can't have your own attorney present. They insist you take everything and give it off to your attorney. I'm not a negotiator. I'm a meteorologist. That's my trade. So I said, so when my contract was coming up in 1986, and I said, look, I'm not going to go through this again. That was horrible. They said, well, you do it or else. And the or else was, you're out of here. So that, by then, the station had already let go male news anchor Bob Vernon, and also Cindy Brucato was let go. And there was a columnist in the Minneapolis paper who got wind of the fact that they weren't talking to me. So I gave him the interview, and the next day there was a newspaper article. The column read, Feltgen may be next to go at KSTP. And I looked at that, I thought, uh-oh. And everything in it was true. And when I walked into work late afternoon, the switchboard operator looked at me and she was very angry with me. I said, what? What did I do? And she says, every single call in here, they're angry. I think I still hold the record for the most number of calls in one evening, 800 calls. So one of the people who saw that column was Tom Kirby, who was vice president and VP for news over at what was then WUSA. And he said, look, if KSTP doesn't talk to you, we will. And I said, here's the name of my attorney. Let's set up a meeting. We set up a meeting. They presented an offer, and I went back to KSTP and said, look, I want to talk, but you need to talk to my attorney. And they said no. And so my contract was set to expire on a Monday. On Friday, before 6 o'clock, they yanked me off the air. And their idea was, well, let's give him a whole weekend to think about what he's about to do. Well, that kind of made my mind up. So that following Monday, I drove across town and signed a contract with KARE. Had to sit out a non-compete. Well, we sued for the non-compete, and I knew all the tricks that would be done, having seen that before at Channel 5. But we eventually settled on something, and I went on the air at KARE in May of 1987, and did the weekends. And I enjoyed my work over at KARE. I admit I was a little bored, and looking back at it, I wish that KARE would have used me more as a reporter during the week, because I pretty much didn't do anything during the week, and I felt quite guilty about it. But while I was there, the station became #1 on both the weekends where I was there and, of course, during the week with the team that they had. And there's an old saying just across the board, if the wife's unhappy, everybody's unhappy, and my wife was miserable in Minnesota, so I left in '89 and went to Florida. Yeah, it was tough. It was admittingly tough after coming from KSTP, where you were the frontline talent, all of a sudden being an afterthought. And quite honestly, that was one of the reasons I wanted to leave. I thought, okay, I need to put my career back on track. And when I went down to Tampa, I went into a position where I still didn't go, I still wasn't the chief meteorologist, but the agreement was that I would become that because they were going to get rid of their weather guy down there. But that all fell apart because the management changed, and they decided, the new general manager came in and decided he was going to go after the news anchors and leave weather alone. So then he downsized the weather department, and I ended up on weekends. I thought, well, I'm basically doing the same job I did in Minneapolis. I'm just in a warmer climate, exactly. But fortunately, down there, I went to the news director and I said, I'm not going to sit around on my laurels during the week. You need to use me. So they started using me as a science reporter and did fairly well with that, including winning an award for that. And then we started losing general assignment reporters, and they threw me in the general assignment pool. So I was doing stuff that had nothing to do with weather or science, which was actually one of the best experiences I could have ever had. I was doing live shots. I was doing field reporting. I was doing airplane crashes. I was doing hard news. I was doing soft news. My last story down there was a feature at a rock concert. So it was a lot of fun, but it gave me the writing skills which I'm still able to use today. Spent 10 years at a ABC, became a CBS affiliate, and Gannett actually bought it down there. The last 2 years I was there, and I thought, wow, I'm working for Gannett again. This is great. I love Gannett. Well, Gannett decided that it wasn't going to be renewing anybody's contracts, particularly contracts for folks who have been around the block a couple of times, long-term contracts in a cost-cutting measure. And I saw the writing on the wall and got out and went to a Fox startup in Charlotte, North Carolina. I had never started a weather operation from the ground up, and I thought this would be a tremendous opportunity to do that. So I went up there, and we were #1 in the first book against 2 established 10 o'clock newscasts. Then after the second year, the family-owned operation decided, hey, all you guys that we brought up here to start it, thanks, we'll take it from here. I thought, you know, I'm getting too old for this. So I thought, I better start looking for something that's got a retirement plan, a pension, job security, and I thought, well, there's always the feds. So I applied for a job with the National Weather Service, and this was right after 9/11, and all advertising had dried up, and there weren't many jobs, even in the Weather Service, and ended up in Glasgow, Montana. And when I got there, I realized I'd made a huge mistake. I'm a city guy, and this Glasgow, Montana, the people are nice, but it was population 2,200 and dropping. There were 15 bars and 15 churches, and the joke was you either drank or went to church, and not necessarily in that order. And Miami wasn't available, but they said, how about Key West? We need people in Key West. And I said, I'm there. So, but one thing I had found in Key West was it was under the umbrella of the Miami television market, but we were largely ignored down there. And being a TV guy, I wasn't too thrilled with that. So I started doing educational videos online. And that put a little light bulb in my eye. I thought, well, why can't I combine the National Weather Service with the television experience? I thought public affairs with NOAA might be a good place to start looking. So I did, and there was an opening in Silver Spring, Maryland, suburban Washington, D.C. at NOAA headquarters. I applied for it and got the position, went up there and did a lot of writing, and thoroughly enjoyed it. And then the person down at the National Hurricane Center retired. And all of a sudden, they needed a NOAA public affairs officer down in Miami. And I really didn't want to go back down to South Florida, because I'd just come to D.C. But my bosses in D.C. came to me and said, you need to apply for this job. You're the person we want. So I went down there and applied for it and got it. And it's one of I was told it was probably the best job in the Weather Service, and they're right. It's a wonderful job. I'm working with people I went to school with at Florida State. But my first love was hurricanes, so I'm back in there. I have met and married a wonderful woman who actually is from Minnesota, from the Twin Cities, and watched me on the air when I was here, which is kind of spooky. So and she was a reporter down in Key West, and when she saw the name and thought, is this the same guy? And wrote me an email. I said, yes, guilty.
No escape.
Yep, no escaping it. So we started dating, and then kept in contact when I was in D.C. and came back, and the rest is history. So I see myself probably staying with that job until the end of my career, which Still is a few years off. Still a few years off. But on a sidebar, my wife and I have already decided, you know, when the time comes, when I'm retiring, we're so back to Minnesota.
Wow.
Yeah, we are so
Just
back.
the opposite of what everyone, you know.
Right.
Here retires and they move down to your neighborhood.
There's so much I miss about Minnesota and the Twin Cities. And when we come back to visit her family and stuff, it feels like I never left. That old term, Minnesota nice, it's so true. We miss the change of seasons. We miss the people. So in about 10, 12 years, you may see us wandering around here again.
Today was kind of a tease, wasn't it? We were expecting a little rain to fall out of those gray clouds.
We were expecting a lot of... One thing I have found in the Minneapolis-St. Paul market than any other market I've ever worked in, people relate to their news, sports, and weather people more than any other location I've ever seen. And it's particularly true in weather. With the folks here, it's personal. And if you don't have that connection with them, you're not going to last in that market. And I was very fortunate to have that connection. And fortunately, not only did KSTP have the people and the equipment needed to do the job, but they had a philosophy that we were not going to live on the hype. We were not going to scare people. We were going to tell them what's going on, here's why it's happening, and this is why it's important to you. And that's a terrific philosophy, which unfortunately today, you see it across the board in so many markets, that philosophy is long lost, long lost. And just as a sidebar on that, one of the reasons I left television was that the stations were being run very differently. In the 70s and the 80s, the people who ran television stations had come up through news. That all changed in the 90s. Now the people that are running television stations and call the shots have come up through sales. They have no news sense at all, and it's quite frankly the reason you see the junk on the air and the sensationalism that you have. And it's sad because the viewer is the one who's missing out. I'm very proud of what I left at KSTP. When I started there, we were the plexiglass map and the grease crayon. We were still a runaway #1, and despite what the overall news ratings were, you know, a little slippage at 10 and bounce back, we were still runaway with weather. And I'm very proud of the legacy, the staff. Nobody does that alone, and I had a staff that I look back and think, wow. Ron Trenda, who's with WCCO, was a part of that staff, and I'm so proud to see Ron on the air as a broadcast meteorologist. It does feel strange sitting in a hotel room or in my wife's son's house looking at the KSTP programs or Karen thinking, wow, I know where that is. I know what they're doing. Why am I not at work? You know, what's going on? Oh, yeah, I changed that 25 years ago. Yeah, I do miss it. My wife was born and raised in Minnesota, and she still has family here. We both miss the Twin Cities in Minnesota a lot, and despite being in the sunshine of Florida and all of that, and no income tax and all of that, no state income tax, there's just so much we miss about Minnesota. And we've already made the decision that 10, 12 years down the road, or earlier, when I retire, yeah, we're coming back. I don't know where we'll live, but we haven't figured that part out yet, but we have every intention of coming back and spending our years through retirement in Minnesota. It's a great place to live. It was a great place to raise a family, which I did with my kids, and it's a wonderful place to retire. Minnesota Nice does exist. I get it from people who are it's all over the country, really, because with the National Hurricane Center I'm working at, my name is on press releases, or I have done interviews, particularly on radio and in print, and I'll get an email saying, are you the same Dennis Vilkin? We watched you for years on KSTP and at CARE. We miss you. Why did you leave? And it's very flattering seeing that, even after all these years. So I figure I must have left a mark. And what's really bizarre is I will get emails from both male and female saying, I went into meteorology because of you. I am now a broadcast meteorologist because of you. That kind of takes me aback a little bit, like, wow, I actually steered this person's career. That's very flattering and very, very humbling. Kevin McDowell was the anchor, and he's when we come to the Weather 2 shot, he's reading a paper, and he's got the want ads out, and he's reading this wanted AMS certified meteorologist, da da da, and I said, that sounds like my job. And so that's when I announced that I was leaving and everything. So at the end of the weathercast, I sat down and I took off my KARE 11 pin, handed it to McDowell, and I said, you know, I never did get that magic decoder ring you promised me. And we did put together a little videotape of the stuff. So I did get to say goodbye to that. But no, I did not get the opportunity to say goodbye to the Channel 5 viewers.
Here's chances to give a message to local Minnesota viewers who are on this website.
Well, for those of you who welcomed me into your homes when I was this wide-eyed, fresh-faced kid from South Florida, and took me into your living rooms and really were such an integral part of the success of KSTP Weather, and to such an extent that you remain that today, I am so grateful, so humbled, and I can't wait to come back to live to Minnesota, because you folks are the best.